Today we wrap up our series on stress, and so this is the last time we're going to be talking about. Matthew and Kevin have been talking about it for 3 weeks, and this morning, as we talk about stress, we're going to kind of focus perhaps on the side that's more, toxic. When I think about stress, the toxic in parentheses and stress is what we're going to look at this morning. Because here's the thing. I don't have to ask people, have you ever experienced stress or how do you define stress? Every single person in this room knows what stress is. We don't have to be like, what do you mean? What is stress? It's not the question that comes up. The question that comes up really when it comes to stress is how do we respond to it? How do we deal with it? Because it's one of the few universal human experiences, I imagine, is that we all, in our day-to-day life, experience stress. And so this morning, I want to give us a chance to not just ask this rhetorically, how do you handle stress? What do you do when you get stressed? You breathe. Okay, you breathe? Great. Thank you, Lauren. Okay, you worry. Yeah. You yell at people. Okay. Hopefully not Beth. Others? Pray. Okay, great. Yep. I'm sorry. Go to the gym. Okay. Cry. Plan. You plan when you get stressed? Man, can you teach me how you do that? So, you can kind of see how I handle stress. I often, when I got stressed, Quick Trip was a nightmare for me because that 32-ounce soda just sounded fabulous. And so, yeah. So, thank you guys for sharing those responses. The reality is, we all respond to stress in different ways, as you just heard from different people. And so, this morning, we're going to be looking at that. And as some of us just highlighted, sometimes stress can be a good thing. If stress helps us plan, that's probably a good thing, or helps us pray and even cry. But that's the problem with stress, right? This is why stress is so complicated, because stress can be helpful, it can motivate us. In college, Beth will tell you she hates this about me. Stress was my motivator. That the night before I had a 10-page paper due is when the motivation kicked in, and I was ready to go. And I'd stay up that night, I'd write the paper that Beth probably took weeks in advance to write and prep, and I'd get in, get the good grade that I wanted, and be happy with it. But then there's the dark side of stress. There's the side of stress where it starts to seduce us into unhealthy habits, whether it's binging on soda, whether it's going into other areas. And I do think, as we look at the darker side of stress, sometimes that's the tip-off point where each one of us might possibly start then to wrestle with feelings of depression. Anybody else here heard of TED Talks? So there for a while, I was like a TED Talk junkie. And I had the opportunity, TEDx KC was at the Kaufman Performing Arts Center for a number of years. And so Beth and I would head out to the TEDx KC conference. And I've never forgotten a talk that was given out there by a psychologist/professor named Dr. Stephen Ilardi. And he works at KU, which is still a good school. Just don't judge us too much. But in his talk, he suggests that part of the reason depression is on the rise in the United States of America is due to the fact that we were never designed for the sedentary, indoor, sleep-deprived, socially isolated, fast food-laden, frenetic pace of modern life. You see, I work with youth, and one of the headlines I repeatedly see as I work with young people, because I try to pay attention, is that here in the United States, depression is on the rise for young people. And actually, it's not just for young people. Statistics say that statistically, all age groups in the United States, those levels are rising. And I want to pause for a moment and just be crystal clear. I'm not going to try and provide some easy answer. I think this is a very complicated issue, and I think there's multiple things going on. I think part of the reason we see depression on the rise is perhaps because we're able to talk about it more as a society than we were perhaps in previous generations. And so we're more open to it, we're more open in talking about it, we're more open in recognizing it. And so just want to be clear that I'm not trying to suggest that I have all the answers for this morning. But I do think maybe we can look at one piece of the puzzle this morning on this complicated issue. Because here's the thing, Dr. Stephen Lardy says that actually statistically speaking, that within this room right here, right now, 1 in 4 of us, so if we went through the pews, 1 in 4 of us here is going to probably experience some type of level of depression in our lifetimes. That's how high the rates have gotten. And so what do we do with this? How do we help one another? How do we wrestle with this? And again, I just want to make sure it's clear that I'm only suggesting one small piece of this very complicated puzzle this morning. But I think when we look at this passage in Romans, this letter that Paul has going on, maybe there's something there that can help us wrestle with this and wrestle with our human nature. Because you see, the passage that Aiden read for us this morning is a passage where no doubt was one of the stressful times in Paul's ministry. Because I don't know if you know this, but churches seldom seem to be perfect. You know, they can be why are you laughing? You know, just like any other organization in society, churches have their moments that can be stressful, there can be conflicts, there can be people, I don't agree with this, and I agree with this. And Paul has one of these moments dealing with this church in Rome and when he's writing this letter. Because you see, there's an issue that's developed in the church. People are gotten so fed up with each other. In fact, they're throwing out labels. Some people in the congregation in Rome, hey, we're strong of faith. You know what? We don't need to worry about any dietary restrictions. We're good to go. We can eat whatever we want. This is no longer important for our faith. We're strong. And then you see these people over here, they're kind of weak. You know, they have to rely on these food labels and whatnot. And just imagine, if you will, for a moment, one morning coming into the sanctuary. And all of a sudden it was announced at the beginning of worship, hey, today we're going to divide you guys up. We're going to have all the people we think are strong of faith over here, and we think all the people that are weak of faith we're going to put over here. How many of us would come back next week? So you see, that's the situation Paul's in. It's almost kind of like, good luck, Paul. No pressure. Don't know how you're going to solve this. This church is probably at a breaking point where some are ready to say, you know what, we're going this way, you go that way. And so Paul comes into this church and writing this letter, and he starts wrestling with the fact that they want to try to separate each other out this badly. And he makes a suggestion. He suggests maybe their desire to compare one another, to evaluate their faith, these ways that they were trying to separate each other into strong and weak, maybe that completely misses the point. You see, Paul says that maybe this is a waste of time because the reality is that in God's eyes, this doesn't matter. A theologian by the name of Sarah Lancaster, writing on this passage, writes, too often Christians live out competition that breaks the body of Christ. Instead of living out the faithfulness to one another that our faithfulness to our Lord requires, as important as it is for each of us to come to an understanding of how best to honor God, we must always be ready to welcome those whom God has already welcomed. You see, Paul makes the suggestion that stop trying to judge and evaluate one another. Stop trying to decide who has strong faith, who has weak faith, because really the only eyes that matter in the situation are God's. And you know what? If God is embracing this person, if God is loving this person, then whatever they decide to eat doesn't matter. What matters is how we treat one another. And you see, this is the connection I want to make with, I think, the issue of stress we have in our society today. Because you see, I don't know about you, but I've personally experienced it seems like, for whatever reason it is, we have this unhealthy habit as human beings where we often compare and evaluate one another, especially when it comes to stress or so many other features in life. You know, sometimes the evaluation quote goes like this: well, I handled my coach yelling at me. Why can't you? Or, I was able to work a part-time job and go to college and get good grades. Why can't you handle that? You see, it just seems to be part of our human nature, or maybe it's our societal nurturing, that somehow we begin to evaluate one another by our own experiences. And this is the problem with experience. Experience is great on one hand, it's something we pass on to the next generation, but I think experience can also blind us. It can blind us because we think if we made it through these struggles, this way, this pattern, this path, then everyone else should be able to do the exact same thing. They should be able to handle what's thrown at them. They should be able to handle it because you know what? I did it. I've been working with young people for about 20 years now in youth ministry. And it's been pretty much a universal uh, comment I hear as I talk to people, as they find out I'm a minister, because, I agree with Kevin on a sermon. I've never forgotten the one where he says, you mentioned you're a minister, and it's just kind of like a buzzkill. But one of the comments I do often hear when people find out I'm a minister is like, I just wish young people would be in church more often today. Why can't young people be here in church and sanctuaries? Forgetting the fact that, I've been around for 37 years now, and even I can remember the day when Walmart was not open on a Sunday. That's how old I am, okay? I can still remember when Walmart was not a 24/7 service device. I can remember when there were days that were marked off for things, because, the young people I know nowadays, usually if they're not here in a pew, it's probably because they're working on some performance, sharing their gifts somewhere else. And the reality is, it's not just young people. We do this for every generation. We sit there, we compare one another, and then we wonder why they can't handle it. My dad would share with you that when he went to college, he worked 3 part-time jobs, and he was able to pay his way mainly through college. But he'll also share with you, back then, tuition didn't cost near what it costs today. That back then it was more realistic that you could actually work and pay and go to school at the same time. And so the real question I think Paul invites us to, as he shares in this passage of Romans, is will we just take a moment to breathe? Will we just take a moment to sit there and see the people around us and not begin to evaluate them and compare and decide who is strong, who is weak? If we will just sit there a moment and breathe and see one another the way God sees us. Made in God's image, worthy of dignity. Because here's the thing about stress, and here's the thing that I think is really tricky about toxic, is the reality is for each one of us in this room, remember how we just highlighted at the beginning of this message time that we all kind of sometimes respond to stress differently? is the reality is we all respond to it differently, which means also that point where stress becomes toxic in our lives is going to be different for each one of us. So then we're missing it if we take our own personal experience, our own personal abilities, and say, oh, this is the measure by which everyone else in this room should be able to handle it. Man, I can't believe they couldn't handle that. Come on. You know, one of the things Beth and I had to negotiate when we got married is Beth is what you would call a planner. She likes to know the details. She likes to know the logistics. And I was flabbergasted last night because she will tell you you don't like surprises, right? Yeah, she absolutely hates surprises. Not a fan of them. And so she likes to be on the up and up. But I found out earlier this week from my good teammate Kelly that there was a surprise waiting for us at trivia night last night on the ministry team. Because you see, Ben asked us all these questions at trivia personally about us. What Ben didn't share with the ministry team is that he was then talking to our spouses to find some lovely pictures. I'm so thankful the phones were in the baskets and nobody could capture them on screen last night. So I kind of give Beth a hard time. I'll confess when I got home last night because I'm like, you never like surprises. And then I find out you knew from this from the beginning and didn't warn me whatsoever. And so this is the thing about, as we come to a close today, that I want to highlight for us. You know, there's a writer by the name of Ian McLaren who says this, and it's become a really popular Facebook meme, but he says, let us be kind to one another, for most of us are fighting a hard battle. Rather than think we know situations, rather we think we know what people can handle, I think Paul says maybe the first thing we need to do is really get to know one another, to get to know why a person might have this or that conviction, to know why someone might be struggling this day because maybe they've lost a loved one in their life. Maybe they've found out about a medical diagnosis. So rather than just react, maybe the first thing as we encounter one another and our stresses that we hold, maybe the first thing we need to do is just pause. To hear one another out, to be kind. As we come to close, I want to draw your attention to the photo, the painting that's been up here, highlighted on the screen during this time. This work is entitled The Scream, and it's very appropriate, I think. And it was painted by a Norwegian man named Edvard Munch, if I'm pronouncing that right, in 1893. So here you go, Ben, you got another trivia. You do paintings one year. But I first came across this painting on the front cover of a book and have been enamored with it ever since. Because I don't know about you, for me, artists often talking about feeling what they're painting and whatnot. It was the first time I kind of came across a painting and I'm just like, you know, I can feel. I don't just see that scream, but I can feel the scream in there. And legend goes, when the artist was asked where he got the inspiration for this work, the legend goes like this, and he shared this story. I was walking along the road with two friends. The sun was setting. Suddenly, the sky turned blood red. I paused, feeling exhausted, and leaned on the fence. There was blood and tongues of fire above the blue-black fjord in the city. My friends walked on, and I stood there, trembling with anxiety. And I sensed an infinite scream passing through nature. What if in 2020 we became known as the Church in Lee Summit, where when you walk in the doors, no matter what's going on, know that you can just let that scream out. If your life is at that moment where it's stressful, where stress has just become toxic for you, you can let it out, knowing the fact that you're not going to be judged, that you're not going to be told, toughen up, You got to be able to handle it, but rather, you know in that moment you'll be embraced. Because the reality is, we all have moments where we scream, where we're just not sure what to do next. And so, what if we became that church where you can come in and be accepted and not be evaluated whether you're strong or weak, but rather you're just seen simply as the human being that you are, wrestling with all the stresses of daily life, like me, like you, like each one of us carry. And that's okay.